Good evening, Bern, and welcome to the 34th Zoom meeting in the Lockdown Lecture Series presented by the Lodge Hope of Karachi, number 337, here in the province of Fife, under the Grand Lodge of Scotland. As ever, Bern, can I remind you of the Grand Lodge of Scotland guidelines when it comes to Zoom meetings? Please keep your camera on and a name that we can understand. If during this, and I know that you're here and bandwidth challenges face you, please put off your video camera without any problems. As ever, Bern, can I ask you to sign the virtual tile within our Facebook pages? And if there's any questions for our presenter this evening, please put them in the chat, and afterwards we will have a question and answer session. I did promise you last week, Bern, that with the bad weather that we're having, that we would bring you some European sunshine. And having just driven back from Glasgow in the most torrential rain that I've ever seen, pretty much because I've never been out of the house for 6 months because of lockdown, it gives me the greatest of delight to welcome to us Brother J. de Costa. I'll give him the full name, J. Deno Souza de Costa. And Worshipful Brother J. de Costa was initiated into the Lodge of St. Michael, 1097, under our cousins of the United Grand Lodge of England in Worcestershire. He's a master-elect of his mother lodge, and he's a past in a variety of other orders that we're all aware of, Bern. But Brother J's involvement in Portuguese Freemasonry began in 2016, becoming a founder member of the Hesperides Lodge, number 119, and serving as its worshipful master in 2018-29. And during that year in the chair, he was fortunate to preside over the 2019 European Masonic meeting held in Lisbon and oversaw the successful twinning of Hesperides Lodge 119 with Andamana Lodge 14 of the Canaries in the Grand Lodge of Spain. Away from Masonry, there is another Scottish connection. He supports Birmingham City FC, and if I know that correctly, that plays at St Andrews, who's our patron saint, Bern. And when he's not conducting Masonic research, he's a keen follower of Worcestershire County Cricket Club, which may be a little bit more alien to us, brethren, here north of the border. But Jay, the floor is now yours, sir. Please talk to us about Lisbon.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you, brethren, distinguished brethren, all for inviting me here this evening to share a little bit of Portuguese Freemasonry with you. You're right. There is a bit of a link here with Scotland. I must admit, I'm a secret Jambos fan. I must admit, but I won't say that too loudly tonight, not to cause any trouble this evening. And also, my mother is a descendant of the Drummonds of Perth. That John Drummond, who settled in the island of Madeira way back in the 1500s, believe it or not, when the island was set up. So any information on that, I'll send that to those brethren later on. So there's a wee drop in there somewhere, as they say, back in Madeira, and that's a link. So here's a Worcestershire boy with Portuguese roots, admittedly, from the island of Madeira. And how does this lead me to my talk this evening? Well, let me explain. Having got into Freemasonry in my hometown, just here in Tenbury Wells in Worcestershire, I did a bit of digging. And during my time at university, I had a year out in Lisbon itself and worked for the British Council, teaching English out in Cascais, beautiful little fishing village just outside of Lisbon. And of course, at that point in time, as somebody who hasn't been initiated into the craft, I had very little knowledge of what was going on, but I knew there was a certain link. And my father had mentioned stuff about Freemasonry in Portugal. His grandfather had been part of it, but it was all undercover because of the regime that ran the country at the time. Obviously, Portugal, one of the longest fascist running regimes of the time, and it all went very quiet. Anyhow, cut a long story short, 2010 initiated. Back out to Portugal occasionally, met a few people. What's the story with Freemasonry in Portugal? Does it exist? And they said, yeah, it does. It's not very open, but it does. And got connected to the right kind of people, got chatting, met a good friend of mine, the Right Worshipful Brother Octavio Souza, who was part of writing this piece on the unique temple of Lisbon. And he got me involved. And lo and behold, we founded a lodge. Later to be master of that lodge. And then it came to the EMM of 2019, and we had to take all these foreign dignitaries. I think we had about 34 different countries represented at the EMM 2019. And we said, right, we're going to have to give them a tour, and we best give them a talk. And we discussed the unique Temple of Lisbon, which is the biggest open secret in Portugal for a country that's, or has been for a long time, fairly anti-Masonry. But it's the biggest open secret in Masonry that needed discussing on this tour. And of course, I will try and enlighten you as best I can with this talk. And that, of course, is Praça do Comércio, which is basically a temple in plain sight. The Da Vinci Code and Dan Brown and all the rest of it are trying to make all these links to Paris and, you know, Washington, DC, and all the rest of it. And of course, we look and try and find links, whereas Lisbon doesn't get much press. It's in black and white. You know, the locals know it. We've known it for years. It literally is confirmed as a Masonic temple in plain sight. Okay, let me try and elucidate and get you to that point. Hopefully I can share my screen with you. Let's try this now. Are we all seeing that, brethren?
Yeah, that's good for me.
Yeah, I can see that. Unique Temple of Lisbon. Okay, we'll make a start. Okay, let me start with the foundations of Freemasonry in Lisbon. Now, what I don't want to give you is a history of Freemasonry of Portugal. We would be here all night. I'm just going to give you a brief bit of history and some of the key Masons that contributed to this. And it will lead me to some links that I'll try and elaborate on a little bit later on. In 1727, the first speculative lodge was established in Lisbon by a gentleman by the name of William Dogwood, and he founded this lodge. He was a Catholic gentleman who resided with his family in Portugal in the capital, Lisbon. The membership of this lodge comprised mainly of English businessmen. Their presence in Portugal was a result of the Methuen Treaty of 1703. The treaty having established an economic and trade link between Portugal and England based on the wine and textile industries. The name given to this lodge by the Portuguese Inquisition at the time was the Heretical Merchants Lodge. The term heretical alluding to the fact that the members were mostly Protestant. With the increased presence of English merchants and traders in Lisbon, a community of approximately 1,000 in number, the lodge grew in stature. In 1735, by command of the Earl of Weymouth, the Grand Master of the Premier Grand Lodge of England at the time, a certain George Golden, a well-known mathematician, was dispatched to Lisbon to grant the lodge recognition. And on the 17th of April of the same year, the lodge was added to the registers of the Premier Grand Lodge, recorded as the Lisbon Lodge, number 135. Now, this was later changed to number 120 in 1740. The lodge ceased its activities in 1755 in the aftermath of the devastating earthquake. There we go. Sorry, let's just get that there. We'll move on to the main lodge of the time that operated in Lisbon. It was founded in 1733, and this second lodge consisted of predominantly Catholic members, amongst them a Dominican priest, members of the military, businessmen, and several operative Masons. They were mainly Irish, with a few English and Scots, and a significant Hungarian member, one Carlos Mardel, the principal architect of Lisbon after the earthquake of 1755. Regular meetings were held monthly at an Irish restaurant next to the Cais de Sodré. I have no idea what the menu was, but we'll carry on. They worked within the ancient traditions and delivered the entered apprentice fellowcraft and masterwork, as well as the excellent master's degrees. The installation of the Worshipful Master was held annually on the 24th of June, the feast day of St. John the Baptist, patron of speculative Freemasonry. As a result of the papal bull, In Emente Apostolatus Specula, from the 28th of April, 1738, and having drawn the attention of the Holy Inquisition, The lodge ceased its labour in September of the same year. A number of the members then defected to the Lisbon Lodge. And this lodge is the Lodge of Virtue. You may be familiar with this individual. I know people, members of our province here in Worcestershire are, because there is a Custos Lodge. So you may have heard of this gentleman here, John Custos. John Custos, born in Bern in 1703, died in London in 1746, was an 18th century Swiss businessman living in England, where he would become a naturalized citizen, having married an English woman. Custos became a Freemason around 1728 to 1729, having previously been a worshipful master of a Parisian lodge. He later became a member of the Premier Grand Lodge of England. While living in London, Custos caught the eye of the British government. Prime Minister Walpole allegedly used Custos and other spies, such as Michel de la Roche, to spy on French Masonic lodges in London from 1730 to 1732 and report back on any activities of exiled Jacobites in Paris. On moving to Lisbon, he founded the Lodge of Virtue in 1741. The lodge membership was mostly French, consisting of merchants and a variety of professionals, including the prominent jewelers Alexandre Jacques Mouton and John Thomas. It wasn't long until Custos came into conflict with the Portuguese Inquisition. He was charged with being a missionary of the heretical Protestant Freemasonry. And in 1744, the lodge was subjected to an auto de fe, or an act of faith, at the hands of the Inquisition, which saw Freemasons tortured for the first time in Portugal. Refusing to divulge the secrets of his order, Custos was incarcerated. During this time, he suffered brutal torture at the hands of his captors. After 6 weeks, which were permitted for recuperation, how very kind, Custos was brought again to the torture chamber. Finding their efforts to no avail, the inquisitors sentenced him to 4 years' service as a galley slave. He was released in 1744 as a result of the intercession of George II of England and the diplomacy of the ambassador Lord Charles Crompton, the Duke of Newcastle, and the Masonic connections of the Earl of Harrington. After his release and his return to England in 1746, Custos wrote a book detailing his experiences at the hands of the Inquisition, the sufferings of John Custos for Freemasonry, and for his refusing to turn Roman Catholic in the Inquisition. And one or two of us have copies of that here in our province, and it's still out there in print to this very day. Principal character here is this chap, and one or two of you who may have visited Lisbon or may have visited Portugal will find this name familiar, for his name is often found on town squares and roads and streets and what have you. And this chap is the famous Marquis of Pombal. Marquis of Pombal, the principal character responsible for the construction of the unique Temple of Lisbon. His full name, Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo, the first Earl of Oeiras, first Marquis of Pombal, most commonly known simply as the Marquis of Pombal, was an 18th century Portuguese statesman. He started his diplomatic career as a Portuguese ambassador to the United Kingdom and later to the Holy Roman German Empire. On his return to Lisbon, he served as Secretary of State for Internal Affairs of the Kingdom, as Portugal was obviously under a monarchy at the time, the equivalent of Prime Minister today, in the government of Joseph I of Portugal from 1750 to 1777. Further to being the most prominent minister in government, historians consider him to be the king's most favoured confidant and advisor, a true friend to the king. Pombal, by vantage of his exalted position, becomes a central figure in transforming Lisbon into a beacon for European Illuminism. Pombal was noted for his swift, competent, and decisive leadership in the aftermath of the 1755 earthquake. He introduced many fundamental administrative, educational, economic, and ecclesiastical reforms, all justified in the name of reason, and pivotal in raising Portugal to a new level of civilization at that time. Pombal's visionary zeal can be attributed to his worldliness and willingness to embrace the enlightened thought of the time. During his service abroad, Particularly in London and in Vienna, Pombal came into contact with the highest echelons of European intellect and immersed himself fully in the philosophical debates of the time. His zeal, intellect, and vision was recognized during his time in England, and he was duly invited to become a member of the prestigious Royal Society. A theory persists that Pombal was initiated into Freemasonry by the Prince of Wales, Frederick Louis, in London in 1744. Afterwards, during his time in Vienna, and by invitation of Emmanuel Teles de Silva Toruca, the Duke of Silva Toruca, he attended several meetings of the lodge, Le Trois Canons, or the Three Canons Lodge. And this is where there's a bit of mist in the clouds here with regards to whether or not he was initiated in London or he was initiated in Vienna. But we know full well that he was a Freemason. Move on to the devastating earthquake. On that fateful day, on the 1st of November, 1755, Lisbon suffered a devastating earthquake. The quake, with an estimated magnitude of 9 on the Richter scale, was followed by the inevitable tsunami. The situation was further compounded by the raging fires that contributed to turning the city into a vision of hell. Now, one must consider that this having happened on All Souls Day, and people were in church praying to their past loved ones, etc., etc. All the churches were full of candles. Obviously, these tipped over. Lisbon was pretty much a tinderbox. Pombal survived by a stroke of luck, and unshaken, immediately took upon the task of rebuilding the city. And here comes the famous quote. Somebody once confronted him and said, "What now?" looking at the earthquake around him. And he came back quickly with the retort, "We bury the dead and we heal the living." He was soon surrounded by a council of skilled operative masons and also enlightened speculative Freemasons. The Hungarian Carlos Mardel was now given the role of principal architect. Pombal was to embrace this opportunity and to make Lisbon, shattered by this so-called divine wrath, into a new Illispolis, a new world for Lisbon. Here is Carlos Mardel. Now, Carlos Mardel, originally known as Mardel Karoly, but then turned to Carlos Mardel, was a Hungarian, born in Pressburg, today Bratislava, in 1695. He later died in Lisbon in 1763. After completing military service for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Kingdom of Great Britain, Mardel arrived in Portugal in 1733 to take a post in the Portuguese army as a sergeant major of engineering. By 1735, Mardel had become the managing architect of the Águas Livres aqueduct, turning the project he personally designed and oversaw, and also the successful construction of the Amoreiras Monumental Arch and the Meia Água Water Reserve, which still stand to this very day. They are prominent Lisbon features, the huge aqueduct that runs into Lisbon. It's often used in tourist photos and all the rest of it, easily found, but he was responsible for it. In 1747, Mardel was appointed architect of the Royal House, reaching the rank of Colonel Engineer in 1751. In 1760, he took over the leadership of the Casa de Reais Obras Públicas de Lisboa, basically the Royal House of Public Works, dedicated to teaching architecture, sculpture, and painting. Mardel was to embrace the Portuguese spiritual tradition in architecture through his connection to the illustrious House of the 24. And this is another project that my colleague and I are in the process of just finalizing now. It's been published in Portugal, but later to be published in the UK. The House of the 24, established on the 1st of April of 1384. And this, for those that don't know, and obviously wouldn't know, is one of the links between operative and speculative Freemasonry. Not only in Portugal, but these guys have got links to the building of Canterbury Cathedral, but this is a story for another day. The House of the 24, having been created by King John I of Portugal as a means of regulating and centralizing the control of the main guilds operating in the city, among them the architects and notably the stonemasons. Mardel also held a prominent position in the second of the Portuguese Masonic lodges, the Royal House of Lusitania. which interestingly functioned in both an operative and speculative nature. Freemasonry was heavily influenced in his work. Its key physiological principles were ever evident: themes of man's mental and moral regeneration, improvements to the individual that would ultimately turn the collective into a more perfect and humane society. Principles that were by no means specific to speculative Freemasonry, but shared by those enlightened groups of the early 18th century. Also to be found in Lisbon's new architecture are the alchemic principles of the Corpus Hermeticum. Introduce you to this other fellow who influenced Freemasonry at the time, Frederick Wilhelm Ernst. Frederick, born in London on the 9th of January 1724 and died in Schaumburg-Lippe, Prussia on the 10th of September 1777. Frederick studied in Geneva, later in the Dutch city of Liège, and finally in Montpellier, France, thus giving him a European outlook and an understanding of several languages. On the completion of his studies, he commenced his military career in England, commissioned as an ensign in the Royal Guards, where he learnt the military arts. The Count of Lippe, at the suggestion of the English King George III to the Portuguese King Dom José I, arrived in Portugal on the 2nd of July 1762 and was given the task of restructuring the Portuguese army. Frederick had been initiated into the German rite of strict observance. His father, Earl Albert Wolfgang, was connected to the European Masonic elite at the time, and it was him that proposed the future Frederick the Great, the Crown Prince's initiation into Freemasonry. Ernst held the sacred values of humanism, spirituality, and the ethics rooted in respect for others and society. He strictly observed the fraternity based on equal opportunities, the correction of inequalities, and respect for all. He practiced tolerance, peace, and understanding, the only way to make the search for light fruitful. Frederick Ernst surrounded himself with officers who were also Freemasons, and they traveled with him to Portugal. The officer class having been instrumental in recruiting Freemasons, not only in the military, but also from other spheres, including the nobility, the diplomatic corps, the commercial and cultural elites. Where garrisons were stationed, soon enough lodges were founded in Lisbon, Valencia, Funchal in Madeira, Coimbra, Almada, Alves, Olivença, Estremoz, just to name but a few. The Masonic ideals were spread amongst the Portuguese that they encountered. The legacy of Frederick Ernst's influence in Portuguese Freemasonry was still very much alive in the middle of the 19th century, according to statements by well-informed brothers such as Silva Carvalho in 1846 and Miguel Antonio Diaz in 1853. Now, we finally get to the point. That's just the background. And that's, like I said, a pitted history of Freemasonry in Portugal, which I could go on for ever and a day. However, we're coming to the crux of the matter here. And that is the temple that lies within plain sight. So it's about time that we entered this very temple. And any visitors to Lisbon may well have very much walked upon its checkerboard floor, believe it or not. Okay. And that's symbolic of the ancient accepted first, second, and third degree that we work in Portugal. Any questions on that, we're happy to answer later. So you feast your eyes on the two columns there at the entrance, and then we'll move to here, Terreiro do Passo, Praça do Comércio, as it's also known in Portuguese. But there you go, right at the bottom of the page there, you can see the two columns from the estuary onto the main square. Like those in the Masonic Temple, these columns are inspired by those of the Temple of Solomon. The pier of columns opens onto the estuary of the Tagus River, into the Atlantic, and further beyond to other continents, peoples, and culture. It therefore forms the gateway to a new world. In return, the pier of columns becomes the portal to the desired temple for any visitor who intends to visit this newly illuminated city. If you look a little bit closer, you'll notice there is something in the center of the square. I'm going to focus on that now. Oh, he says, There you go. The Sanctum Sanctorum. In the center of the temple, we have the Sanctum Sanctorum, which serves as an altar for the sacred writings, here depicted as a life form of the Portuguese ruler, King Joseph I. The sacred writings serve as the nexus between the spiritual and the material world. Here, in the human form of the king, God's representative on earth. From his central position facing the columns, he scrutinizes those who seek admission. And if considered worthy for admittance, he would welcome them into the sacred temple that is Lisbon, a city of enlightenment fit for the new epoch. On studying the statue in more detail, we note the scepter. You can see that there in his right hand, an ornamented staff carried by emperors, kings, high priests, or hierophants, as a representation of the power granted by the Most High, thus establishing the connection between heaven and earth. Below him, at the hooves of his steed, we note two snakes. If you look carefully there, you'll see some snakes there by the hooves of his steed. A reference to the ancient and symbolic name of Lisbon, or Fusia, and of its inhabitants, the office, the people of the serpents. Now, on the rear of the plinth is this sculpture. Now, for those who have visited Lisbon, and you may have spotted it, very keen-eyed people have spotted this, you'll notice one or two Masonic symbols on this sculpture, and this is what leads people to ask the question. So on the rear of the plinth, we have this carving. A sculpture is set, only visible to those positioned in the east and not visible to those entering the temple. Here we have a hidden message that will remain unseen to those uninitiated. So those who enter the temple from the two columns won't see this because it's on the rear. So only the initiated will see this. That's the idea behind it. Bit of a closer focus. In the center, I'm just going to highlight, we'll go back to that in a minute. In the center, the Holy Mary, Mother of the whole universe, representing the nation of Lusitania, and the Holy Child, the symbolic future of the empire, a further symbolic link to the Most High. On the left-hand side, we have a Roman warrior holding a fallen maiden, representing Rome, a decadent and fallen empire, returning the heraldic shield of the city back to the Holy Child, a representation of the transference of the past to the present. The Holy Mother of the Universe points towards the future, a new era for the empire. Adjacent, we have the lion, representing the alchemic gold, the highest achievement of the alchemist in the art of an esoteric transformation, the discovery of the philosophical stone. A pelican, in its piety, a mystic symbol of charity and self-sacrifice, familiar to those knights of the Rose Croix or perfect princes of Herodom. Beside the pelican, a man messenger showing the treasures, we'll come on to that in a second, sorry, treasures from Brazil and the seven corners of the world. Both material, especially the gold from Brazil, and spiritual, the richness of the Oriental and Occidental cultures. Above the messenger, a muse, presenting the landmarks and plans for the new Lisbon, laid by the correctness of the square and the spirituality of the compass. And I think those are the two signs we can see there, which are the square and compass. I'm just going to move those away there. The square and compass held there. If you look towards the right, there is a square and compass being held by the two individuals there with the plan in hand. On the far right, another muse that features two keys and a rudder. The keys that are to allow access to the new era, and the rudder to navigate towards its destiny. It can also be interpreted as a symbol of Janus, the patron god of the Collegia Fabrorum, a nod to the operative traditions in the construction of this city of enlightenment. And those are the carvings. Now going to move to what lies on either side of the square. The north and south. Given the esoteric and traditional Masonic knowledge held by Carlos Mardel and that of those who accompanied him in the task of reconstructing the city overseen by the Marquis of Pombal, with his depth of mystical knowledge, the temple was to incorporate a square of arches or arcana, whose entire tarot is in the number of them, with a dolphin head above each arch, a symbol of the philosopher's stone. The book of Tot or tarot, that of this god Hermes, who the Hindus call Ganesha, consists of 78 cards or blades, the first 22 of which are gold or esoteric, the major arcana, and the remaining 56 silver or the exoteric minor arcana. And we can see these here. In relation to this, in fact, there is an intentional symbolic reference in the temple's own arcade that goes beyond the structural function of its architecture. The lateral buildings to the north and south contain 28 arches each, the total sum of which is 56 arches or minor arcana, as in the tarot. The east, on the opposing side of the square between the streets of Uru, gold, and Prata, silver, there are 22 arches, 11 in each direction from the Rua Augusta or the Majestic Road. The 22 arches correspond exactly to the number of the 22 major or initial arcana. If the arcane that corresponds to it is applied to each arch, it can then be interpreted as a completion of the manifestation of its entirety in relation to the 56 arches, symbolizing the profane public manifestation. And as for the 22 frontal arches between the Ruas de Ouro and the Rua de Prata, the initiatory realization is actually hidden to those that don't know. The monumental triumphal arch is the representation of the celestial Jerusalem, a conception figured in a patent Gnostic symbolism. Heavenly Jerusalem descending over the chosen city, and in this case, Lisbon. And these are the three roads that run behind the major arch. So you leave the square and you have the three roads. And this is all relating to alchemy in this sense. So you've got the silver road, the majestic road in the center, and the gold road. Sorry, let's go back. In the east, there are three roads: the silver road on the right-hand side, the gold road on the left, and the majestic road running centrally, leading from the triumphal arch. Just as the lesser lights in our Masonic temples, they are and they mean to represent the sun, the moon, and the master of the lodge. The sun to rule the day, the moon to govern the night, and the master to rule and direct his lodge. The arch itself, let's have a closer look at that. There you go. At the top of this monument, we note the glorious Lusitania as the great universal mother, the laureate Apollo and Minerva, the enlightenment and the understanding, or on the other hand, glory crowning genius and valor. She is the laureate, the crown of the Magi of the 22nd card of the tarot. That sums up the entire manifestation of the world. There follows another scriptural group where the following national figures can be seen. Viriato, representing Lusitania, a Celtic warrior who fought the Romans, or pre-Portugal. Vasco da Gama, the champion of maritime discovery. Nuno Alvares Pereira, symbol of national independence. And Sebastião José de Carvalho, the Marquis of Pombal, representing Portuguese modernity. They are flanked by the allegorical representations of the Tagus and the Douro rivers. You can see those on the left and the right-hand side there. On the facade between the genius and the valor is inscribed Virtibus Maiorum Vicit Onibus Doctorem Pecuna Publica Decatium. I should have spent more lessons in my Latin lessons, but I didn't. May they be a lesson to us all, dedicated to public expenditure. So highlighting the heroes of Lisbon. Connecting the people to the worship of their superiors is a perennial lesson for all Portuguese and a remarkable example to those who visit the country. They arrive in Lisbon to be struck in awe of this triumphal arch. And this is where they're all located. I near the end of my explanation of this unique temple of Lisbon by showing you this picture here. That is a depiction of the very same square prior to the earthquake. Note that there are no columns on the pier, merely cannons, a fort protecting the town from invaders. In the center of the square, there is no sanctum sanctorum, personified by the image of the king. There are no minor or major arcana in the north, south, or nor in the east. No moon, no sun, or great architect of the universe. The unique temple of Lisbon had yet to be conceived at this point. Thank you, brethren.
Jay, on behalf of all the visitors here this evening to our lockdown lecture, I thank you very much for bringing some Masonic sunshine, let's say, to a very dark and wet Scottish evening. I'm sure many of our brethren have visited Portugal and they've seen that square in a totally different light now. I'm sure there will be some questions in the chat. Let me just go over here and see what we've got. There is another brother from Worcestershire saying hello to you in the chat, Brother Alan Breard. So let's just move our way down. We do have brethren from all around the world listening to us this evening, Jay, from as far away as Trinidad and Tobago, India, wow. Ireland, England, Scotland and Wales. So we're very well travelled. So the first question for you, Jay, from Brother Stuart Saunders in Germany, one of our international visitors. Which way round are the pillars at the entrance to the lodge, i.e. is Boaz on the left or the right?
Depends which way you're facing is the answer to that. So to the uninitiated, you wouldn't know one way or the other. But Boaz to the right if you are in King Joseph's position in that respect. Yet there is no markings on those pillars. The celestial and terrestrial globes can be vaguely made out on them, but they're not overly apparent to this very day.
Okay. Stuart Donaldson's asking, what year did you mention the excellent master's degree?
Yes, we don't have a date on this, but from what we've found out is that these were the workings, what they've recorded, that these are the workings of the lodge that was working at the time. Now, some of you might know a little bit more about this, but I think this is something more to do with the ancients working, because this was by Irish brethren, if I'm not mistaken. And all we have is a recording of the initiation fellowcraft and what they call the excellent master's degree. So that I just mentioned that because that's what it was. That's what we found. That's what was recorded. I believe that those that know more about the ancients might be able to fill me in on that one.
Okay, we've got a comment from one of our very well learned and educated brethren from Dundee, one of our good researchers, Brother Ian McIntosh. That's a $5 you're due me in. He's asking, he's saying that he's interested in further information on Mardel Carole or Carlos Mardel. Yeah. And he's saying it's interesting to him is his mother's family name is Mardel, double L, or Mardel, single L. So I will connect both of you afterwards in the Facebook, and I'm sure you'll be able to swap notes on that. Joe Priest is asking, has there ever been any Masonic meetings held in the square?
Actually, in the square itself, not to my knowledge, other than me giving a few tours to visiting brethren at the time, no actual meeting, I don't think, was held there. I'll fill you in a little bit about the square because some questions are often asked after the meeting about it. They often say, how do they get away with it? And I made that point at the very beginning. Well, you mentioned it's openly known as a Masonic square or built on esoteric, of an esoteric nature. And yes, the locals knew it. And of course, Portugal at the time heavily Catholic and, anti any other kind of idea. How did these enlightened folk get away with it? And the answer was this. Marquis of Pombal was instrumental in the rebuilding, and he pretty much had carte blanche. After the earthquake of 1755, like he said, bury the dead, fix those that are injured, and let's just get on with it. And they had to. And of course, because he was surrounded by these enlightened Masons of the time, the likes of Carlos Mardel, etc., he was unable to do this. Now, this isn't the only place within Lisbon where this happened. This is the most obvious, which is the major square. And he did this without question. The king was on his side. I think the king was fairly enlightened. He didn't want to be bullied by the church at the time, and he just let the Marquis of Pombal get on with it, and he did it in his own fashion. And there's no disputing the Masonic or esoteric links within the architecture that now resides there. One of my favorite stories at the time, though, was the devastation that happened in Lisbon. If any of you have ever been, you may have gone to the old town, Alfama, up on the hill, it's probably the only part of Lisbon that looks the way it does prior to 1755. And the Bishop of Lisbon at the time came clutching the tails of the Marquis of Pombal and said, "My God, this is the wrath of God. We've been punished by God for all our sins," and all the rest of it. And Marquis of Pombal, being an enlightened character, pointed out to him that the headquarters of the Inquisition had been destroyed by the earthquake, yet the brothels on the hill were intact. And he therefore said, well, if the house of the sinners have been protected by the Lord and your house has been destroyed, go figure. And I love that story. And if any of you are fans of Voltaire, Voltaire famously put this in one of his pieces. There's a little joke in there by Voltaire that makes reference to the Lisbon earthquake and this very point, that the house of the sinners were preserved, whereas the house of the Inquisition was completely destroyed by the earthquake. So who are the true sinners? And I think that was the sentiment that the Marquis of Pombal had in rebuilding this. And that's why he got away with so much, not only in this square, but further through town, if you were to progress from this square further into town.
Okay. One of our Burn brothers, Sandy Thompson, says he sat in the square with 3,000 fans and watched Portugal win at football, and he did not realise he was in a temple, and I'm sure he was drinking more than the communion wine when he was there with the 3,000 fans. Brother William Shand states he worked for several years in Angola, and he asks, do you know if there were any lodges operating there prior to independence?
Prior to independence, I don't know. I know that the Grand Lodge of Portugal are making big inroads into their lodges there now. They're pulling them into underneath the Portuguese umbrella, as it were, to give them a bit more credence. Prior to independence, that I can't help you with. Sorry, I don't know.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Jim Gardner asked, the early lodges mentioned were very cosmopolitan. Were and are the native Portuguese supportive of Freemasonry?
Well, this is true. Now, this brought me to the point that I mentioned when I first joined Freemasonry and spoke to a few, because I'd read a few bits and bobs. And I know the Duke of Beresford, during his time there, during the Napoleonic Wars, there were one or two lodges that said, "Can we process through town?" And they said, the locals, quite strict Catholics, were totally opposed to this, and they said no. There were Portuguese members. That is true. We know that. Were there solely Portuguese-speaking lodges only after influence from European merchants, other European merchants, as it were, the English, the Irish, the Scots, as it were? But they came later on. Was it embraced? No, and it went very quiet. It went underground, I must admit. Even till after the regime, until after 74 and the revolution, it was still quite quiet until the 80s, and then it came out again. But I don't want to go into the whole history of Portuguese Freemasonry, because that would be here all night.
Yeah, I think the next question, Jay, leads on from that, from David Brown. How hostile to Freemasonry was the Salazar regime?
Yeah, not too dissimilar to Franco. It did go quiet. The big difference being is there were clandestine Masons within the regime. They had to go quiet. And they operated within, and we only found out about this later. When Salazar then disappeared, they came out the woodwork in that respect. Those that were active in the fraternity left. They did leave. They either went to Brazil or they went to other places in Europe. The most famous being is Mario Soares, who was the first democratically elected prime minister after the regime, who openly stated that he was a Freemason. He was made a Freemason in France, the Grand Order, the Orient of France, and later Grand Orient of Lusitania. And he never shirked the fact that he was a member of Freemasonry, but that was purely after the end of the regime. And they soon came out the woodwork. But even then, it still went quiet. And there's still a bit of tension with regards to the political atmosphere around Freemasonry to this very day. It's not. Okay. It's by no means open as it is here in the UK.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Our member of the Tartan Army who travelled with the 3000s is asking a football-related question. Was Ronaldo ever introduced to Masonry in Madeira?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay.
No. My parents spent 40 years in the UK, and they've happily retired back to Madeira now. But his mother lives across the way. I might go and pop over and ask her.
or take a paper with you for him.
Possibly, yeah.
David Parks asking, are there any English-speaking lodges in Portugal?
Yes, there are. Let's see, 2 years ago now, I was happy to be at the rededication of the Britannic Lodge. And the Britannic Lodge meets on the island of Madeira. There used to be a UGLE Lodge, Britannic Lodge, which I think handed in its charter in 1986. It was re-established a couple of years ago. It's now under the banner of the Grand Lodge of Portugal, but it works in English, and it's emulation ritual, one of the few emulation ritual lodges that we have in Portugal, and it's all in English, and they're happy to receive visitors.
Thank you, Jay. That's the questions that we have in the chat. So once again, Brother Jay Costa, on behalf of the members of the Lodge Hope of Karachi and all our visitors here to our weekly lockdown lecture series, can I thank you very much for a very interesting and enlightening presentation on the temple in Lisbon. And I'm sure when everybody gets back to normal, they'll be jumping on the EasyJet and the Ryanair and going out to Lisbon to enjoy the hospitality and just have a little look at the symbolism that you've talked about. Indeed. So, Jay, thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Brethren, for your time and attention. Thank you so much. I'll put one or two links in the chat there for you now. If you've not been to Sintra and seen the initiation well there and the Masonic secrets that hide there, I'll just put a link in there and you can watch the little BBC clip that was out a few months ago. That's
brilliant. Thank you very much, Jay. Brian, as all of you who follow me on Facebook, you'll be very well aware we are now within Remembrance Tide. And I apologise to any of you if I spoilt your tea last Friday when I was on the television. But I felt that it was important that we mark this period. Next week's guest lecturer is Worshipful Brother Alan Breward. He is a Matlow Bren, so I do apologise in advance, but he will come along next Tuesday evening and talk to us about a very special place for our nation, the National Memorial Arboretum. Brother Alan has been a volunteer there for many years, but he will talk to us not just about the National Memorial Arboretum, but also its connection to Freemasonry and many of the symbolism that is there. So I do hope that as many of you can join us next Tuesday evening for what I know will be a very interesting presentation from a very special place. Brennan, with that, I'm going to try and unmute you all and allow you to say your thank yous and good evenings. But please just unmute if you can.
Thanks so much, Jay. Very interesting.
Thank you very much, Jay.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay.
Jay, it's a great lecture again tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. Very interesting.
Thank you, Jay. I enjoyed that.
Thanks, Gordon, for organising it.
Thank you, Jay. That was absolutely super. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, brother.
Excellent, Jay. Well done, Jay, and of course, Karachi.
Thank you, Jay. Excellent lecture. Thank you.
Great stuff.
Thank you, Jay. That was a very interesting lecture.
Cool.
Thanks, Jerry. Appreciate it. Very educational. Thank you.
I'm a Villa fan.
We've all got crosses to bear, son.
Thank you, Jay, from a fella Kings Heath, Worcester Mason.
We'll meet up soon, I hope.
Aye.
I can recommend a visit to Centre as well, Jay. It was very interesting. The King's Palace up there is absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Excellent. Been in that square a few times. Never realised.
Yeah, like me beforehand, I never knew until after.
Yeah.
Well done, Jay. Excellent.
Thank you, Jay. Nice lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Bren, I'm going to give you 5.
Thank you, Jay. Excellent.
Well done, Gordon. Thank you.
Four.
Thanks a lot, Gordon.
Thank you, Gordon.
3.
All right. Thanks a lot.
We just do the countdown, Jay, so I can prove to him that I can count. 2.
Thank you.
1. And good evening, and thank you, Bren.